When it comes to fires in U.S. history, you may think about the Chicago Fire in 1871. While the Great Chicago Fire was indeed a very devastating fire, the U.S. has had many bigger fires, such as the Peshtigo Fire. The Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin, which happened the same day as the Chicago Fire, was roughly 4 times deadlier, killing an estimated 1,200 people as opposed to the 300 in the Chicago Fire. No idea why the Chicago Fire is the one that is more well known as opposed to the Peshtigo Fire, but regardless, neither are the topic for today's video. What we will be talking about is the Big Burn of 1910, a fire that raged through the Northwest, particularly the Rockies of Montana and Idaho. That would only last 2 days. The fire would scorch over 3 million acres of land, thanks to a series of unfortunate weather conditions. So what happened? Why did the fire break out, and why are fires such a problem for the West? You see, it has to do with that area's climate and habitat. Where the fire raged through was and is mostly forest surrounded by grassland. This area and areas like these are prone to forest fires. Before colonization, the indigenous peoples of these areas knew this and used fire to their advantage, clearing brush for pathways, burning old growth to make room for new growth, and to better facilitate agriculture. However, when these people were forced out of their lands, all this stopped. Now the brush, especially in the forest, was able to accumulate, as the people who now own the land did not know how to use fire to control and manage the brush and prevent large fires. The forest was especially important to them as they lived near it and profited from the lumber, both selling it and building with it. These people didn't want fires on or nearby their property, as it was very hard to control fires back then, especially in rural areas where the nearest fire station may have been a day's trip away. So what would happen, and what commonly still happens, is that the brush piles up and up and up until a drought occurs, drying out everything and setting the stage for a wildfire. The late summer of 1910 approached with an ominous, sinister, and threatening portents. Dire catastrophe seemed to permeate the very atmosphere. This is what happened over the summer of 1910. Even before the Big Burn, the Forest Service, a fledgling agency of 5 years by then, was already up to its hips in smaller fires to control in and around the northern Idaho and northwestern part of Montana. By August 10th, reports began coming into Missoula, Montana, that fires had broken out and were quickly spreading in the area, including the Lolo, Cabinet, Flathead, Blackfeet, and Kennesaw National Forests. President Taft was even convinced to send 4,000 U.S. troops to help the Forest Service fight the flames. At first, it seemed like the extra manpower was what was needed to help stop the flames. In fact, by August 19th, several men were being released from fire duty and sent home while the remainder put out the last of the fires. Then the worst-case scenario happened. Gale-force winds came rushing over the area. As the wind swept over the plains and into the burning area, not only did it fan the flames, it carried them. So not only did the small fires grow in intensity as they spread, they were combined with other fires in nearby forests into over 1,700 huge blazes in the northern Rockies. In the matter of hours, millions of acres of forest was up in flames. At this point, it was obvious that no amount of effort or manpower would be enough to quench the flames. The fire was out of control. Accounts from the firefighters on the scene and other witnesses reveal just how large, hot, and fast this fire was. The whole world seemed to us men back in those mountains to be aflame. Many thought that it really was the end of the world. Under such conditions, it would have been worse than foolhardy to attempt to fight the flames. It was a case of saving our lives. The men were in a panic of fear, some crying, some praying. Many of them soon became unconscious from the terrible heat, smoke, and fire gas. The wet blankets actually caught fire, and I had to replace them with others soaked in water. But I, too, finally sank down, unconscious. Firebrands the size of a man's arm were blasted down in the streets of towns 50 miles from the nearest fire line. The sun was completely obscured in Billings, 500 miles away from the main path of the fire. You can't outrun wind and fire that are traveling 70 miles an hour. You can't hide when you are entirely surrounded by red-hot color. You can't see when it's pitch black in the afternoon. They were men who went stark raving crazy, men who flung themselves into the onrushing flames, men who shot themselves. For days, the air had been laden with smoke, flying embers, ashes, singed twigs, and moss. Some pieces as large as a hand or foot falling promiscuously about. Needles from the fir and pine trees rained profusely through the air, falling like showers upon roofs and the ground. The sound was identical with that of rain. It was evident that fires were raging in almost every direction, and that day by day they were drawing near to us. Our constant prayer was for rain. The fires kept burning well into the next day until a cool front came in from Canada, bringing with it some much-needed rainfall which finally put out the flames. Over 3 million acres of forest were burned, some areas reduced to nothing but ash, and several small communities were wiped off the map, including Taft, Montana, which at the time had over 3,200 people in it. The smoke from the blaze reached all the way to New England, and the soot reached even farther, with some being found as far out as Greenland. Despite this fire being the biggest by area in American history, only 87 people died in the flames, 78 of which were firefighters. After the devastation, support for the Forest Service saw a massive wave of support, and America at large focused on not only putting out flames, but preventing them entirely if they could. However, their efforts to minimize fires would only backfire, as the only way to prevent wildfires is to conduct controlled burns and let naturally occurring smaller fires burn themselves out, something we have only recently been implementing on a large scale in the West. Of course, it wasn't long after the fire that ecologists, foresters, and other figureheads came to the conclusion that small smoldering wildfires were the key to preventing large unmanageable fires, highlighting the tactics of the indigenous peoples that lived in the area previously. However, it would be a very long time before the Forest Service, with much of its funding hinging on the fight all fires at all costs idea, would finally accept that conclusion. Forest Service leadership and forestry leaders like Gifford Pinchot thought otherwise and worked for years to suppress and discredit such arguments. In the aftermath of 1910, Chief Graves staked the agency's continued existence on the belief that it could in fact defeat fire. Toward the end, Graves embraced a cooperative approach with state and private associations to fight fire, realized the next year through the Weeks Act, and soon launched a fire protection campaign that involved in removing fire from the landscape and changing how Americans viewed fire. The campaign, which would lead to the creation of Smokey the Bear in 1944, would last for more than half a century and completely change forest ecology throughout the country during its lifetime. Other nations adopted the American fire suppression model with equally devastating results. It wasn't until the 90s that the Forest Service's chief, Jack Ward Thomas, announced the Forest Service's new approach to forest fires, that some needed suppression, such as those that posed great risks to humans and habitat, but that others needed to burn in order to clear up accumulated brush and prevent a larger fire later. Now the U.S. implements a policy of selective firefighting and prescribed burning to help prevent large fires. Populated areas and at-risk zones are also built with fires in mind, with fire breaks built throughout and in between towns and cities. However, wildfires are still an issue and will only increase in frequency as climate change worsens drought seasons.